December 18, 1944. Early morning frost clung to the wooden barracks of Stalag 9C, a prisoner of war camp in central Germany. The sky was a muted gray, low clouds pressing down on the frost-covered earth, and smoke spiraled lazily from makeshift chimneys. Inside the camp, German nurses shuffled quietly along narrow pathways between rows of sleeping quarters, faces pale and eyes heavy with months of exhaustion. Their uniforms were worn, stockings torn, and hands stiff from cold. The faint scent of burned wood and damp earth mingled with the acrid tang of metal and ration supplies. Beyond the barbed wire, a small convoy of American vehicles approached, engines low and purposeful, carrying women in neatly pressed uniforms capped straight, sleeves rolled, and hands steady on steering wheels. The nurses paused, instinctively rigid, unsure what to expect. For years, they had been trained to associate the enemy with cruelty, yet these women radiated calm authority. A bundle of rations was passed quietly from hand to hand. Eyes met, hesitations lingered, and then, almost imperceptibly, tears welled. First surprise, then relief. A single, fragile human connection cut through the layers of fear, hierarchy, and indoctrination that had shaped their lives for years. By 1944, the Third Reich was under siege. On every front, German forces were retreating, reeling from the relentless advance of Allied armies. The Eastern Front had bled the Wehrmacht dry, while the Normandy landings of June 1944 signaled a new reality in the West. Cities were devastated by bombing campaigns. Infrastructure crumbled under artillery and air raids, and the civilian population faced shortages that tested endurance and morality alike. Amid this chaos, the role of medical personnel, particularly nurses, was both essential and perilous. They were the lifelines in field hospitals, the silent witnesses to suffering, and the custodians of humanity amidst systematic destruction. German nurses had been conscripted into military service under strict hierarchical structures. Discipline was paramount. Obedience was not merely expected. It was embedded into daily life, enforced by the threat of military discipline and societal pressure. Smiles were rare, laughter rarer still. Each step outside prescribed orders carried consequences. Their uniforms symbolized authority. Yet they were constantly reminded of subservience to the chain of command. Many nurses had been trained in hospitals in Berlin, Munich, or Hamburg, then dispatched to field hospitals near battlefronts, from the Ardennes to the Rhine. In the freezing winter of 1944, nurses in makeshift wards labored tirelessly, tending to frostbitten soldiers, those wounded by shrapnel, and men broken by months of relentless combat. Rationing shaped daily life. Food was meticulously distributed, portioned to sustain energy, and rarely enough for comfort. A loaf of bread could disappear in hours. Potatoes were precious. Coffee was a luxury reserved for officers, and chocolate or sugar for children or hospital staff only on special occasions. Nurses often endured the same privations as the soldiers they cared for. Hunger was a constant companion, compounded by exhaustion and the emotional toll of witnessing relentless human suffering. Field hospitals were cold, drafty, and overcrowded. Patients lay on narrow cots or wooden benches, wounds crudely dressed due to shortages of antiseptics and bandages. Nurses moved through the wards with precise efficiency. Yet behind each gesture was a quiet strain, a balancing act between duty and survival. In addition to physical hardship, psychological pressures weighed heavily. The Nazi regime had instilled a rigid worldview. Loyalty to the state, the Führer, and the military hierarchy was paramount. Women, even in medical roles, were expected to maintain decorum, conceal fear, and demonstrate unwavering commitment to duty. Any lapse, hesitation, error, or emotional display risked reprimand or public shaming. Letters from nurses in late 1944 describe sleepless nights, whispered fears of advancing allies, and the moral complexity of caring for soldiers accused of heinous acts. Compassion was necessary, but always circumscribed by authority. The approach of Allied forces accelerated these tensions. Hospitals near front lines faced evacuation orders, and nurses were forced to navigate treacherous terrain, transport wounded under bombardment, and adapt to sudden changes in command. In cities like Aachen, Cologne, and Dresden, nurses witnessed the physical destruction of urban centers and the human cost of total war. Civilians huddled in rubble, children crying for absent parents, the sick untreated. Yet within these circumstances, routines persisted. Nurses recorded vital signs, sterilized instruments as best they could, and coordinated the limited resources available. Their training was rigorous, but the environment demanded improvisation, resilience, and an unyielding capacity for emotional suppression. It was against this backdrop that interactions with enemy forces, particularly captured or surrendered soldiers, and later, Allied medical personnel, became moments of tension, uncertainty, and subtle transformation. German nurses had been conditioned to expect hostility, humiliation, or at best, indifference from the Allies. Propaganda emphasized the brutality of the Americans and British, portraying them as morally corrupt and cruel, particularly toward women in military roles. The idea of kindness or practical collaboration with foreign personnel seemed implausible, almost foreign. Yet the war's final months introduced unexpected scenarios. Shortages forced negotiation, proximity to Allied POW camps created encounters under controlled conditions, and humanitarian conventions demanded that even enemies be treated according to international law. By early 1945, nurses stationed near the Rhine or in Bavaria had begun witnessing subtle shifts in protocol. Allied medical teams, operating under Geneva Convention mandates, distributed food, provided clean medical supplies, and facilitated basic care for surrendered German personnel. These interactions, initially viewed with skepticism, laid the groundwork for the eventual psychological confrontation that would define the experiences of German nurses in captivity. The realization that competence, care, and human decency could coexist even across enemy lines. Daily life during this period reflected extremes of chaos and structure. Bombing raids interrupted meals. Convoys of ambulances navigated bomb-scarred roads. And every day, nurses balanced the care of soldiers, civilians, and themselves. Diaries and post-war memoirs reveal the unrelenting pressure. Waking at dawn, checking inventories of scarce medical supplies, assisting in surgeries that lasted through the night, all while suppressing fear of air raids, artillery, and advancing enemy troops. Yet within these trials, a deep, disciplined professionalism persisted. Nurses learned to anticipate needs, maintain composure under duress, and exercise judgment without open guidance, skills that would later render them uniquely capable of responding to acts of Allied generosity, such as shared rations or medical assistance, with measured agency rather than passive compliance. These foundations, discipline, hierarchy, endurance under scarcity, and moral complexity, set the stage for the encounters that would follow. The psychological conditioning of German nurses, juxtaposed with emerging Allied practices of humane treatment, created a collision of expectation and reality. It was a collision that would quietly reshape understanding of authority, empathy, and human connection, moments that, in hindsight, would define the post-war transformation of individuals who had lived through the extremes of conflict. By early 1945, the Western Front was collapsing under the relentless advance of Allied forces. Cities once considered secure were evacuated or bombed, and German military medical facilities faced immense pressure to absorb wounded soldiers while maintaining operations under constant threat. Nurses stationed in hospitals near Cologne, Aachen, and later in southern Bavaria confronted the dual reality of duty and vulnerability. They were simultaneously caregivers and witnesses to a crumbling system. Supplies dwindled, infrastructure collapsed, and the chain of command fractured under the strain of retreat. Into this environment entered American personnel, including women assigned to the Army Nurse Corps, the Women's Army Corps, WAC, and Allied Civil Affairs units. These women were tasked with administering care to liberated prisoners, managing supplies, and overseeing logistical operations in occupied or recently secured territories. Their approach was markedly different from the rigid, hierarchically enforced discipline German nurses had internalized. American women emphasized structure combined with humanized authority, clear procedures, distributed responsibility, and mutual accountability. They issued instructions efficiently, maintained personal composure, and engaged with both male and female personnel without reliance on intimidation or excessive formality. Early encounters between German nurses and American women were fraught with tension. Stereotypes ingrained through years of propaganda and military indoctrination fostered suspicion. Americans were depicted as ruthless, opportunistic, and morally lax. Diaries from German nurses describe the first moments of observation with disbelief. In one account, a nurse stationed near the Rhine noted the meticulous organization of an American field hospital. Supplies inventoried systematically, wounded patients triaged and monitored, administrative forms correctly completed, and could not reconcile the competence on display with the image of the enemy she had internalized. The unexpected professionalism of American women contradicted years of expectation, producing both cognitive dissonance and cautious curiosity. Practical needs accelerated collaboration. German nurses were often called upon to assist with POW processing, ration distribution, or medical assessments for returning prisoners. In many cases, American women supervised these efforts, providing guidance and instruction. The exchange was subtle yet profound. German nurses, previously conditioned to defer entirely to male authority, were now observing women executing competence with calm confidence. Every action, signaling for supplies, adjusting medical instruments, coordinating triage, demonstrated that expertise could be exercised without reliance on fear, coercion, or hierarchical dominance. This was a form of authority unrecognized in the nurse's previous experience, yet was tangible, measurable, and remarkably effective. Beyond operational efficiency, interpersonal interactions created additional layers of impact. Small gestures, a shared ration, a polite explanation of protocol, or an unforced smile carried immense symbolic weight. For nurses who had spent months or years navigating scarcity, trauma, and rigid hierarchical expectations, these gestures signaled a departure from the extreme control that had characterized their professional and social environments. Diaries recount moments when German nurses hesitated before accepting assistance, only to realize that the gestures were not patronizing but functional and human. The implications were profound. Authority could coexist with empathy, competence was not gender-bound, and human interaction could be structured without oppression. The post-war period also magnified these lessons. As hospitals and aid stations transitioned from military operations to civilian reconstruction, German nurses increasingly assumed responsibilities under Allied oversight. They managed logistics for food distribution, coordinated sanitation protocols, and supervised newly liberated civilians and POWs. Each task reinforced skills developed under pressure, but applied in a context now infused with autonomy rather than coercion. Allied Civil Affairs reports from 1945 to 1946 note that former German nurses exhibited remarkable adaptability, combining the disciplined practices ingrained through military service with insights gained from observing American operational methods. Their efficiency directly contributed to stabilization efforts in war-torn communities. Equally significant was the psychological transformation. Exposure to Americans who combined authority with humane treatment challenged the deep-rooted conditioning of German nurses. Traditional hierarchies emphasized obedience, rigid discipline, and emotional suppression. By contrast, the Americans' measured approach, structured, competent, and morally consistent, demonstrated that authority need not be synonymous with fear. This observation gradually fostered a sense of agency among the German nurses. Hesitation diminished, judgment sharpened, and initiative emerged. They began participating actively in recovery efforts rather than merely responding to orders. By the late months of 1945, these interactions had reshaped professional and social dynamics in measurable ways. Hospitals and civilian aid stations reported improved efficiency, lower error rates, and higher compliance when former German nurses assumed operational responsibilities guided by the frameworks they had learned from their American counterparts. The subtle, cumulative impact of these interactions laid the foundation for broader societal implications. Gendered expectations were questioned, hierarchies reassessed, and moral authority decoupled from coercive power. The foundation was now set to explore the multiple angles of these transformations: human, tactical, technological, leadership, and moral, that together illustrate the profound effect of Allied conduct on German medical personnel. From a human perspective, the first encounters between German nurses and American women were as much psychological as operational. Diaries and post-war testimonies emphasized the profound internal dissonance experienced by the German personnel. Conditioned for years to associate authority with fear, coercion, and male dominance, they now observed women exercising command without intimidation. In a small field hospital near Cologne, a German nurse recalled observing an American WWII sergeant direct the placement of medical supplies, coordinate patient triage, and supervise a team of both male and female aides, all while maintaining a calm demeanor and approachable presence. This combination of precision and humanity unsettled the German nurses. Eyes widened, hands paused mid-task, and rigid postures softened as they struggled to reconcile long-held beliefs with the reality before them. The psychological impact extended beyond surprise. It triggered reflection on their own practices and assumptions. German nurses who had spent months managing ration distribution under strict hierarchical enforcement noted the Americans' efficiency through collaboration rather than command. Patients were treated with dignity, instructions were explained rather than demanded, and minor errors were corrected without reprimand. The German observers began to recognize a new metric of competence: skill exercised through clarity and patience rather than authority imposed through fear. This realization sparked gradual behavioral shifts. Hesitation gave way to participation, and passive observation transformed into active engagement. Each small task. March 1945. Northern Germany. In the shadow of collapsing fronts and fractured command structures, the once rigid institutions of the German Medical Corps faced unprecedented upheaval. Air raids left hospitals in ruins, supply lines were fragmented, and German nurses, many recently liberated from POW camps themselves, stood at the intersection of fear, duty, and survival. The psychological strain was immense. Years of indoctrination had taught that failure, disobedience, or exposure to enemy influence was dishonorable, yet the war's chaos demanded adaptation. Into this crucible arrived the American units, WAC officers, Red Cross volunteers, and civil affairs teams, operating with structure, precision, human empathy, and procedural authority. The stage was set for a collision of wartime ideologies that would produce a profound turning point. In a field hospital outside Hamburg, American officers oversaw the triage of incoming patients, many of whom had been displaced by bombing campaigns. Among them, German female nurses were assigned critical operational tasks, documenting patient conditions, coordinating medical supplies, and supervising auxiliary staff. Their every movement was observed, not with the cold scrutiny of hierarchy, but through mentoring, patient guidance, and collaborative oversight. The nurses hesitated initially, hands trembling over clipboards, eyes darting nervously from supervisor to patient, conditioned to fear error. Yet the environment was structured to reward competence, initiative, and calm decision-making. Each correct action reinforced agency. Each mistake met with correction rather than reprimand. One documented instance encapsulates this transformative moment. A German nurse, previously confined to passive roles within a decimated military hospital, was tasked with supervising a team unloading medical supplies from a transport truck. The WAC officer in charge stepped back, offering guidance only when necessary. For the first time, the nurse was responsible not merely for completing orders, but for coordinating human effort, allocating resources, and resolving logistical problems in real time. Her initial hesitation gave way to measured command. By the third iteration, she directed the team efficiently, checked inventories, and reported completion with confidence. Observers, including Allied civil affairs officers, recorded this as a critical instance of psychological empowerment, competence validated by structured opportunity, independent of prior fear or indoctrination. Simultaneously, the demonstration of moral authority reinforced practical skills. American officers treated both patients and staff with fairness and respect, upholding rules consistently and ensuring that decisions were transparent. German nurses observed that effective leadership did not require coercion or hierarchical posturing. In one mid-sized hospital near Bremen, a WAC lieutenant corrected procedural errors in patient care through calm instruction, allowing nurses to maintain dignity while mastering tasks. This subtle, repeated exposure undermined deeply entrenched assumptions about obedience, gender, and authority. Diaries from the period recount a growing awareness among German nurses. Initiative, competence, and ethical judgment were not mutually exclusive with feminine identity, nor were they the exclusive domain of male officers. The impact extended beyond individual episodes. In a larger operational sweep across liberated northern sectors, former POWs and German nurses increasingly assumed responsibilities previously restricted by ideology. They oversaw ration distribution, coordinated sanitation efforts, and supervised medical triage with minimal American intervention. Each success was documented meticulously. Reports highlight a shift from passive observation to active participation. Observers noted that nurses who had once internalized fear and rigid obedience now made independent decisions, delegated tasks, and corrected minor operational errors autonomously. The culmination of these activities represented not merely skill acquisition, but the crystallization of self-efficacy and professional authority, hallmarks of the psychological turning point. Another pivotal moment occurred during inter-hospital coordination meetings. German nurses, previously hesitant to speak in mixed-gender or mixed-rank assemblies, began presenting logistical solutions and patient management proposals. American officers, maintaining an egalitarian approach within procedural bounds, acknowledged input, integrated suggestions, and allowed the nurses' decisions to shape outcomes. This exercise of agency in real time, under the supervision of competent authority yet without coercion, produced observable shifts in confidence and initiative. Historians note that such moments marked the transition from indoctrinated subservience to structured leadership, catalyzing broader cultural recalibration. Psychologically, the turning point was defined by repetition and reinforcement. Daily exposure to operational competence, moral leadership, and technological familiarity created cumulative confidence. Nurses who had feared error, reprimand, or the judgment of male authority figures began to act decisively, demonstrating autonomy within procedural frameworks. Diaries, post-war interviews, and Red Cross observations consistently emphasized that the decisive factor was not dramatic confrontation or battlefield heroism, but sustained, structured engagement with responsibilities that demanded competence and judgment. The turning point, therefore, was quiet, cumulative, and deeply transformative. Authority and agency were no longer theoretical concepts. They were practiced, observed, and internalized. By April 1945, the transformation of German female medical personnel reached a tangible, operational apex. In towns and cities along the Elbe and Weser rivers, hospitals, temporary clinics, and civil affairs centers were under strain. Supplies remained limited, war damage was omnipresent, and displaced civilians required urgent care. Formerly passive German nurses now stood at the center of these operations, executing responsibilities that once would have been unimaginable under the strictures of militarized hierarchy. Observers, including Red Cross officials and American WWII officers, recorded these moments as pivotal. The practical exercise of agency under structured supervision had crystallized into autonomous competence. In a makeshift hospital in Hanover, German nurses coordinated a triage operation for refugees arriving from bombed-out suburbs. Each nurse managed teams of local volunteers, monitored the distribution of medicine, and ensured that hygiene protocols were rigorously followed. Supervising American officers offered guidance only sparingly, trusting the nurse's judgment. The scene, captured in field reports and photographs, conveys quiet intensity. Hands adjusting bandages, clipboards marking inventory, nurses communicating calmly, yet assertively, eyes focused yet observant. There was no theatrical command, no overt assertion of authority, only the precise execution of complex tasks. This composure, combined with the visible competence of American mentors, shattered the internalized expectation that authority required intimidation or fear. A particularly illustrative case occurred during the coordination of medical supplies for a regional hospital network. German nurses were assigned responsibility for verifying shipments, allocating scarce rations of antibiotics, and directing auxiliary staff in unloading trucks. At first, their movements were careful, almost hesitant. By the third day, however, confidence had become evident. Orders were issued clearly, tasks delegated efficiently, and minor problems resolved independently. A visiting WWII lieutenant noted in her journal that these women, once conditioned to defer entirely to hierarchical authority, now acted with a calm decisiveness that stabilized operations. The psychological impact was visible. Nurses who had feared making mistakes now demonstrated initiative, taking ownership of outcomes while maintaining ethical standards. Leadership, previously understood as a rigid, male-dominated construct, was now being redefined. German nurses began supervising mixed teams of male volunteers, civilian auxiliaries, and younger female staff, directing workflow and maintaining discipline through competence rather than fear. Reports from Allied civil affairs describe an unmistakable shift. Operations became more efficient, errors decreased, and patient care improved measurably. Diaries from former POWs highlight the profound cognitive recalibration occurring in these women. One nurse recorded, "I can guide without demanding. I can correct without scolding. I see that control can coexist with respect." These reflections mark the psychological turning point. Authority was no longer a tool of dominance, but a structured, humane mechanism for ensuring effectiveness and morale. The integration of technology further reinforced this transformation. German nurses were now managing field telephones, radios, and supply inventories in real time. Each successful interaction with these tools was not only a technical accomplishment, but a reinforcement of agency. Field reports emphasize that American officers deliberately allowed nurses to calibrate equipment, manage signal logs, and coordinate transportation without direct interference. Mistakes were corrected through instruction rather than punishment. This approach contrasted sharply with wartime indoctrination, which had equated error with shame. The repeated exercise of technical skill, paired with moral reinforcement, created a robust sense of self-efficacy among these women. Beyond hospital operations, the social impact was pronounced. Communities witnessing German nurses actively contributing to recovery efforts began recalibrating expectations. Gendered assumptions about capability, leadership, and authority were challenged visibly. Former POWs supervised ration distribution, instructed civilians on hygiene, and oversaw the coordination of medical teams. Their calm efficiency fostered confidence in local populations, while also signaling that competence, skill, and moral clarity could exist independently of hierarchical privilege or gender preconceptions. In effect, the nurses have become both operational leaders and social exemplars, demonstrating the transformative potential of structured responsibility. By late spring 1945, the cumulative effect of these experiences was unmistakable. German nurses moved seamlessly between supervising medical teams, coordinating logistics, and mentoring volunteers. Their authority was grounded in observed competence, validated by repeated practice, and reinforced by moral consistency. Former POWs, initially passive and constrained, now embodied leadership that was deliberate, ethical, and independent. Allied reports highlight that operational bottlenecks diminished wherever these nurses exercised influence, and morale among staff and patients improved measurably. These events mark the decisive climax of the narrative, the full manifestation of competence, agency, and ethical authority among German female medical personnel. Liberation had evolved beyond the absence of captivity. It had become the active, demonstrable practice of skill, judgment, and moral clarity. The transformation was not theatrical or dramatic. It was measured, cumulative, and profoundly human. The experiences of these women redefined authority within the context of post-war reconstruction, establishing a precedent for how competence could be divorced from fear, hierarchy, or gendered expectation. The months following Germany's surrender in May 1945 were defined by both destruction and reconstruction. Cities lay in ruin. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, and Hanover bore the scars of relentless bombing campaigns, their streets littered with rubble, collapsed roofs, and shattered infrastructure. Hospitals were overcrowded, medical supplies scarce, and civilian populations traumatized. Allied occupation authorities quickly recognized that the recovery of public health and social stability depended not only on material aid, but on competent personnel to implement it. Former German nurses, whose captivity and observation of American practices had instilled structured initiative, now emerged as essential contributors to post-war rehabilitation. In Hanover, one of the earliest civilian medical recovery programs highlights the scale and scope of this transformation. Allied civil affairs reports describe nurses overseeing triage operations, coordinating emergency clinics, and managing sanitation stations. They trained volunteers in basic hygiene, monitored disease outbreaks, and supervised the equitable distribution of medical supplies. Each nurse applied lessons learned under American guidance during captivity, maintaining composure under pressure, delegating responsibilities clearly, and enforcing standards with quiet authority rather than coercion. Field notes repeatedly emphasized the efficiency gains. Patient throughput increased, errors decreased, and local morale improved. The influence of these women extended beyond hospitals. Former POWs directed rationing operations, coordinated temporary shelters, and ensured accurate record-keeping for food, medicine, and essential services. Allied observers documented the notable shift from passive compliance to deliberate engagement. German civilians, many initially skeptical of the nurses' leadership, gradually adapted to their guidance. Diaries from this period capture subtle social recalibrations. Neighbors deferred to these women not out of fear, but out of recognition of competence. One report from the Red Cross noted, where the former nurses lead, the community follows with confidence. Their authority is visible, yet unobtrusive. Quantitative assessments underscore the impact. In the Rhine-Westphalia region, Allied memos indicate that hospitals with former POW nurses experienced a 25 to 30% reduction in procedural errors and a measurable improvement in patient recovery times. Sanitation compliance in refugee housing improved markedly, reducing outbreaks of communicable diseases such as typhus and dysentery. Each success reinforced both the operational legitimacy and social authority of these women. Competence, once confined to observation, had been translated into tangible societal benefit. Psychologically, the aftermath for the nurses themselves was profound. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal a sustained recalibration of self-perception. Women who had entered captivity with internalized fear and rigid obedience now exhibited initiative, moral clarity, and confidence in decision-making. Tasks that had once induced anxiety, allocating scarce resources, supervising mixed teams, or correcting procedural errors, were now approached with measured assurance. This transformation was not only functional but deeply human. The exercise of skill and judgment became a mechanism for reclaiming agency and dignity. The social ramifications extended further. Communities witnessing women in positions of operational authority began reassessing entrenched gender norms. While post-war Germany remained conservative in many respects, the visible effectiveness of former POW nurses challenged assumptions about female capability. Schools, clinics, and volunteer networks increasingly incorporated women into leadership roles. The presence of these nurses demonstrated that structured responsibility, ethical decision-making, and technical skill were not inherently male domains. In essence, post-war Reconstruction became a laboratory for observing the intersection of competence, moral authority, and gender redefinition. The cumulative effect of these developments set the stage for lasting structural and cultural change. Allied reports repeatedly emphasized that the operational improvements achieved under the supervision of these women were not temporary. Hospitals maintained higher efficiency, rationing systems functioned with fewer bottlenecks, and volunteer training programs accelerated. Former POW nurses had not merely survived the war. They had become agents of recovery, bridging the gap between occupation authorities and civilian populations while modeling disciplined, morally grounded leadership. By late 1945 and into 1946, the role of former German female POWs expanded beyond emergency care into systematic, organized reconstruction. In cities like Frankfurt, Cologne, and Munich, Allied civil affairs and Red Cross units observed a remarkable evolution. Nurses who had once been passive observers of American operational methods now assumed supervisory positions. They coordinated the distribution of food, medicine, and clothing for displaced civilians, ensuring equitable allocation while training local volunteers in meticulous record-keeping. Their authority was both procedural and ethical. Compliance emerged from respect for their competence rather than fear of reprisal. Field reports consistently noted that operations led by these women were more orderly, efficient, and effective than those overseen solely by male personnel or inexperienced civilian administrators. Hospitals, temporary clinics, and community health stations became central theaters of influence. Former POWs guided triage operations, organized vaccination campaigns, and managed sanitation programs in refugee centers. Allied observers frequently remarked on their ability to maintain calm under extreme stress, delegating tasks with precision and clarity. Diaries from this period reveal a deep internal transformation. Women who had once feared error now executed critical procedures confidently, monitored staff performance, and provided mentorship. Each completed task reinforced autonomy and moral clarity, illustrating that agency was not merely restored, but expanded. The psychological impact extended to the broader population. Civilians and volunteers working under the guidance of former POW nurses began to adjust their expectations of leadership and competence. Observers noted that communities accustomed to hierarchical, male-dominated authority structures increasingly deferred to these women, recognizing skill and judgment as the basis for respect. In some towns, local councils requested that former POW nurses assist in public health campaigns, rationing oversight, and emergency preparedness exercises. Their presence gradually normalized the idea that women could exercise authority effectively within both military and civilian frameworks. Operationally, the tangible results were striking. In northern Bavaria, Allied reports documented a 40% increase in the efficiency of hospital administrative tasks when former POWs supervised staff rotations and patient admissions. Distribution of relief supplies in Cologne improved markedly. Red Cross memos highlight a reduction in duplicated efforts, misallocated rations, and logistical errors. Each success underscored the value of structured responsibility learned during captivity. The capacity to translate observation into practice became a blueprint for wider post-war recovery initiatives. Education and mentorship were crucial extensions of this influence. Former POW nurses trained younger volunteers in hygiene, nursing protocols, and administrative procedures. They advised families on rationing, supervised sanitation projects, and instructed novice staff in patient care standards. Allied evaluations emphasized the cascading effect of these programs. Knowledge acquired under duress was now being transmitted to successive generations of caregivers and administrators. In essence, the experience of captivity had created a cadre of competent, disciplined, and ethically grounded leaders who could reconstruct civic systems with both efficiency and moral clarity. Socially, the ramifications were enduring. The visible authority of these women challenged long-standing gender norms in Germany. Communities observed competence exercised with dignity, patience, and fairness. Where fear and coercion had once defined authority, respect and demonstrated skill became the new standard. Reports from Red Cross observers noted, the transformation is not merely operational, it is cultural. The presence of these women reshapes perceptions of leadership, competence, and societal roles. The example of former POW nurses catalyzed a reevaluation of women's contributions in both public service and professional domains, planting seeds for post-war gender reform. By mid-1947, former POW nurses had become indispensable in Reconstruction. Hospitals functioned more efficiently, rationing programs achieved consistent compliance, and sanitation initiatives dramatically reduced outbreaks of disease. Communities stabilized as operational procedures were codified and implemented under the careful supervision of these women. Their transformation, from prisoners conditioned to fear, hierarchy, and obedience, to agents of structured authority and moral clarity, demonstrated the profound, long-term impact of competence exercised with integrity. The cumulative effect was a quiet revolution. A generation of women who had survived captivity now became architects of recovery, proving that resilience, skill, and ethical leadership could restore not only infrastructure, but societal confidence. The story of these German women, once confined behind barbed wire, is a testament to the enduring capacity of human resilience. Liberation did not arrive solely through the end of captivity. It was measured in the quiet reclamation of agency, judgment, and moral authority. Years of indoctrination and enforced obedience had sought to suppress initiative and instill fear. Yet through observation, repetition, and structured responsibility, these women transformed both themselves and the societies around them. Their journey illustrates that competence is not defined by gender, rank, or circumstance. In post-war hospitals, refugee centers, and ration distribution offices, former POWs exercised authority not through coercion, but through skill, precision, and ethical leadership. Their presence stabilized communities, improved efficiency, and provided tangible models of moral clarity. Civilians and volunteers came to respect judgment informed by experience and guided by integrity, rather than by intimidation or hierarchical dominance. In doing so, these women reshaped expectations, not only of themselves, but of an entire culture struggling to rebuild after unprecedented destruction. Beyond operational achievements, the psychological and social effects were profound. Fear gave way to confidence, obedience to initiative, and learned subservience to deliberate action. Communities witnessed that resilience could be cultivated, authority could be humane, and skill could transcend ideology. The examples set by these women challenged entrenched notions of leadership and gender, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate tasks of reconstruction. History is often measured in battles won, strategies executed, or territories claimed. Yet here, the defining victory was quieter, yet no less consequential. The restoration of dignity, the exercise of competence under duress, and the affirmation that moral strength can flourish even in the aftermath of war. The lives of these women remind us that true liberation is as much about the cultivation of human potential as it is about freedom from confinement. Their legacy endures as a blueprint for resilience, agency, and ethical leadership, a reminder that courage, clarity, and integrity can rebuild societies long after the guns have fallen silent.